Well, welcome back, everybody, to yet another random surprise E3 discussion here on my channel. This is part 2 of 2, and we'll be seeing if part 2 becomes more than 2 in the future. This is kind of the beginning of an experimental period kind of on the channel trying to do this stuff. But with E3 counting down, holy smokes, it is like days away. It starts this coming weekend. Nintendo's thing is just in a few days. Really exciting. I wanted to have another one of these chats with another good friend of mine, and of course a fellow YouTuber. So I am joined by my friend AndresRestart.
Hey.
And we're going to talk more random E3 stuff. So Andres, I know you pretty well the past, 7-8 months. Been on your podcast a couple times. One of my favorite channels, super cool dude on YouTube. And we've talked like a couple of times about how to find a way to get you on my channel so we can kind of start collabing in this direction as well. Yeah, and so this kind of turned out to be a good way to do it. The last sort of conversation here right before E3 starts so we can dive a little bit deeper into it. So yeah, just touching base. How you doing? How you feeling, man? Your channel's been blowing up recently, which is good. So, how's things?
Yeah, man. Thanks for the very kind words. It's been great. I'll say that my goal is still to hit like 10K like by Nintendo's E3 Direct. So I'm like 5-6 days away. I need to get like 150 subscribers or so. But I've been growing. It's been pretty exciting. Yeah. So I mean, it's been a good time. There's still so much I wish I could talk about before the E3 Direct, actually. Like, I kind of want to do, like, a specific kind of video for different Nintendo franchises. And I've touched on some of them, but I won't be able to get to all of them. Like, today I just put out, like, my final E3 predictions, which kind of encompasses most things. But there's just been so much to talk about. And once we get that Direct, like, there's just my brain is just gonna explode with all the things we can sort of speculate on and talk about.
Yeah, it's gonna be game on once that happens, man. It's crazy. After all this, weeks and months of build-up and hype, like it's actually gonna happen. And I will say, I mean, I know you're really close to 10,000 subscribers. I can attest to how good that milestone feels. And I've said it before, and I'm gonna keep gushing again. Like Andres' channel is one of the best as far as just like Nintendo content and speculation. I would hope that a lot of my audience is already subscribed to. I feel like we'd have a pretty good amount of crossover. But you never know. So I mean, as many people as possible, man. If you like what we talk about, please go check out his channel. Get this man to 10K before E3. Like, it's got 150 subscribers. The rate you've been growing this year specifically, dude, I think you're going to hit it.
It's going to be close. We'll see. But thank you for the support. Regardless of what happens, it's going to be a good time.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. So glad you're here. So we'll kind of jump into the E3 stuff. Andres and I were talking right before we kind of started recording here. It's interesting because, I kind of had a conversation with my other friend, Super Metal Dave, last week about a lot of this stuff right after Nintendo had announced their E3 plans. And it was really exciting to coordinate with Andres to do it again this week, right before the E3 weekend, hoping that there would be new significant information. Obviously, there's a couple of larger tier announcements that maybe all of us had our eye on the past week to 10 days. And really nothing super significant has happened. So the majority of this conversation, in a lot of ways is going to be just you and me just sort of hashing out and talking about a lot of the stuff that we've all covered like on our channels. And we've all been talking about on YouTube and on Twitter and stuff for like weeks and weeks. But just to sort of further dive a little bit deeper as we count down the final days before the show. But luckily, Andres also reminded me of one pseudo-breaking potential kind of piece of news that's Zelda-related. We're not going to start with that. We're going to obviously talk Zelda, so we'll get into that kind of breaking Zelda thing a little bit later. So at least we have that one thing, and I thank you, Andres, for letting me know right before we went live. That's something actually happened. Very cool. So, okay, so on to the good stuff. Last week, Nintendo announced their plans. It's the normal thing that we expected, the Treehouse and the Direct. And last week I asked Dave kind of what his thoughts were the very day that it happened, and now it's been a week or so. So just to kind of, get things going, man, just in general, again, I know you've discussed it on your channel, but how do you just feel about what the plans are going into E3, your excitement level, the 3-hour Treehouse, just, just where you at?
Yeah, so, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I don't know, because there's so much that could happen. There's so much potential, right? Because both of us were content creators, right? So whatever comes as Nintendo fans, we're gonna be super excited about probably, right? But then we also have to sort of like cover it and talk about it, and how those plans sort of all line up and perhaps get in the way of work schedules and things like. So there's so many possible things that could happen. Like my brain is just kind of like, I don't want to say mush, but there's a lot of things that are kind of like swirling around my brain considering as possibilities, because it can go in so many different directions, right? Like the Zelda thing that we're not going to talk about yet necessarily, but like it may end up being the case that it's some sort of physical pre-order that will have to go to GameStop on June 15th to do, but we're going to be watching the Direct and watching the Treehouse footage, which is basically going to be about like a 4-hour block if you count everything together, right? So I don't know what's going to happen. Like, I'm excited, I'm nervous, I have a lot of anticipation for what we're going to see. And, you know, I'll say that just looking at the announcement itself, right? It's very, very interesting because unlike previous times when Nintendo announces a Direct, they haven't specified anything. Like, there's some specifications in terms of, like, you know, maybe not expecting hardware, right? Like, they say this is going to be about exclusively for software on Nintendo Switch, right? It's interesting they put that wording because that implies, well, it won't be 3DS stuff, which is a given. It won't be mobile stuff, which should be expected because they never really do that during big E3 Directs. But it also suggests that there won't be any sort of hardware discussed either, which also doesn't normally happen. But the fact that they felt the need to specify that, I feel like that does sort of hint that there is some truth to the Switch Pro rumors, right? So there's that to consider. But the other thing I wanted to get to is that they said mostly releasing in 2021. And again, we can try and pick that apart. Does that mean Breath of the Wild 2 is not coming or not? We don't know from just that, right? But there's also games like Splatoon 3 and Legends Arceus and Triangle Strategy that we know for sure are coming in 2022, and they all have pretty good chances to be talked about during the Direct. So it could just mean for those games and nothing else, and everything else could be new. So it's kind of hard to sort of like for sure know what they mean by that. But the other interesting thing is that they didn't specify a focus like they usually do. Like, they didn't say this is going to be about Zelda and Smash Brothers or about Pokemon and Splatoon. Like, they just said, we're going to have a Direct. We have no hints in terms of what the focuses will be, right? Because they normally say some sort of focus, but then, of course, they talk about other things on top of that. We don't know what that's going to be. Theoretically, there could be no Zelda at this Direct. I doubt that, but theoretically, that could be the case, and that's kind of, like, exciting, but also nerve-wracking at the same time.
Yeah, I would say it's really good points you bring up, and I would say that based on that tweet, the closest to any sort of specificity they gave us really was what you also said, which is the focused on games mostly for 2021, and then also focused on Nintendo Switch software. Like, it's not as specific as they do a lot of other times, like you said, when they say this is about Smash Brothers or you're going to see Zelda. They really are just like, it's games, which, as you said, obviously everyone's been thinking about Switch Pro stuff, and we're going to get to that, obviously. And so it does seem like they were kind of aware of the conversation, and they're trying to temper expectations in such a way. But I think it's kind of exciting that they're leaving it open. They just were like, it's games. It's a Direct. It's E3, games, end of tweet, kind of, right?
Yeah.
And that makes me really excited. I think it's kind of funny how you talked about, like, being a little bit nervous. And I totally relate. I think most of us relate to that, because every time there's a Direct, it doesn't have to even be an E3 Direct, right? Like, every time there's a Direct, expectations are through the roof. All of us are guilty of building up our own expectations in our own mind. Obviously, you know, most people can handle those expectations well if they don't pan out. We do know sometimes there are people who don't handle that well. But it's just funny how we always think, oh, a Direct is coming. I hope it's got these 7 things that just I want. And that never happens. And so it's always about, you know, getting really excited for a Direct and then having it come out and then maybe not feeling like you got all the things you want. And it's like, there's no really like perfect answer for that, because there's millions upon millions of people watching, and every person has a different, you know, perfect list of games than the person next to them. So you can't make a Direct or an E3 Direct that just works for everybody. It's just got to kind of be an overall tight, entertaining package with hopefully some big games, and we all just kind of feel how we feel about it. And So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that you used that wording, that you get kind of nervous because, directs can disappoint just as much as they can excite us, and it's just all about how we react once it's over.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, go ahead if you had something.
No,
to add.
I was just gonna say that, like, I'm just kind of thinking now, like, imagine from like the staff's perspective, like Nintendo staff's perspective, when they're putting together these directs, and maybe even the people who decide what games show up during the direct, like, they're probably thinking, okay, how can we put together the best show possible for our very highly varied,
passionate
and passionate Nintendo fan base, right? Because you have the Animal Crossing fan base, you have the Pokemon fan base, you have the Super Mario fan base, the Metroid fan base, the long forgotten F-Zero fan base, right? Like, there's all these different types of fans that prefer different kinds of games, and Nintendo has to try and appeal to everyone, and that's not very easy to do, right? So, like, for example, I don't care about Miitopia at all, right? But that's a big focus right now in terms of Nintendo's marketing, So, like, if I were to just look at May as for me, I'd say it's trash because I have no interest in Miitopia, right? But it's not to say that Miitopia is bad at all. It's just not my taste, right? However, March, we got Monster Hunter Rise. April, we got new Pokemon Snap. February, we got 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. And I enjoyed all of those games. So, there's different kinds of fan bases there. So I'm just kind of thinking, about the people who make the decisions about what's there. I imagine it's got to be a pretty tough job, especially when there is a lot of blowback after these directs sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a really good point, to kind of remind yourself that, hey, there are, like, human beings behind these decisions. And what I wonder, kind of on that same sort of line of thinking, is the people who are responsible for that and maybe know when some reactions might not be the best, but they are not in the position of authority to make that call. So maybe they're like, oh man, Doug Bowser keeps telling me to send out these Miitopia tweets. No one really wants to hear it, but that's my job, is to send the tweet Doug Bowser wants me to send, and see people yell about it, like, where's Zelda in the responses and stuff.
Or where's my Switch Pro, not a pony.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so it's like, and when it comes to putting together a direct, it's probably the same thing, only amplified, because the E3 Direct, I'm sure that most of the people involved in the overall production and the social media and the YouTube and stuff for Nintendo know that all people want is a lot of Zelda. They want Metroid Prime 4. They want a new Fire Emblem. They want Mario Odyssey 2. And all the things that aren't those games are going to get people upset. And they're probably like, I hate that I have to put in this weird Mario horse riding game that no one's going to want, or, and it's like, that's just, it is what it is. But again, I just like your point, because it's like people are behind these decisions, and a lot of times they don't have the choices, and they just have to do what the higher ups say. Like a company that big, there's like a room of a couple of people who decide what goes in every direct, and everyone below them just has to follow suit. And so, and so it's, don't get mad at social media people. I think that's the message we're trying to say, is don't get mad at the social media people.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, I feel like if you pay attention to, like, the Smash reveals and the reactions to them, that's kind of like a good sort of example, or like just a good example of how things sort of pan out this way. Like, for example, I really was excited for Pyra and Mythra being added to Smash Brothers, right? But there was a great deal of people who thought it was a terrible, terrible reveal, which to me was just highly, highly perplexing. It's like, look, we actually got Nintendo characters for a Nintendo fighting game from a beloved franchise, and the character's pretty different from previous characters. So why don't more people love this, right? Like, it's just interesting how sometimes the fan bases will react to different characters. It's hard. It's sometimes kind of hard to predict how it'll be. And of course, there's also the vocal minority, right? Like, just because it seems like the fan base hates it when you look on Twitter and such, that isn't necessarily the case. There's probably a lot of people who really enjoyed it, but they're not as vocal because they're not complaining.
Definitely. Yeah. And you can usually look at game sales, or in terms of Smash, like DLC sales, like everyone's buying the Fighters Pass. Mm-hmm. So, people can complain about Minecraft Steve all day, but they've got the Fighters Pass, so Nintendo's made their money in that respect. So interesting stuff, but I kind of want to move on a little bit from that And I want to touch a little bit more on the Switch Pro stuff. And, again, reminder, I know we're kind of talking about similar topics here, but there's not a lot of new stuff. So this is just a chance for Andres and I to just kind of riff on some of these same things leading into the E3 weekend. We've even already kind of called out, again, how within the tweet about E3, they call out the software, which to me was very much a nod to the fact that they know people are talking about new hardware and a Switch Pro and yada yada, and they're trying to temper expectations with that one line saying, hey, we're not going to announce necessarily, or feature maybe, I guess we don't know, but basically they're saying there's not supposed to be hardware, we're only talking about games. I've got my own thoughts, shared them in the last video, shared them in a couple of other videos, I know you have as well. But, we were expecting and hoping, and Bloomberg was teasing this whole reveal before E3, and I mean, there's still a couple of days to go, to be fair, but it's, with every passing day, it seems less and less likely. So with where we stand right now, at the time we're recording this, which is Wednesday evening, what do you think about the Switch Pro, the part of the tweet that calls out software, Bloomberg stuff? Where are you at with that?
So it's interesting because it's not just Bloomberg, right? There's a few other sites that have sort of corroborated the same information, like Eurogamer, for example. And they both have said that, yeah, this is happening. It's coming September or October, and expect an announcement probably before E3. Now, they didn't, maybe they didn't use the word probably, they used the word likely, something along those lines, right? The ultimate meaning being that it is expected for it to happen before E3, the announcement, even though there's a chance it may not. But the reason for it is because a lot of third-party companies involved with E3 want to showcase Switch games that are utilizing the power of this new Switch revision. That's what was talked about in these reports, right? And these are reputable sites. I trust them. They've reported about things in the past and have been true. These aren't like 4chan rumor posts or anything of that nature. This is a little bit more on the serious professional side of things here. So, I believe it, but at the same time, and I believe we've talked about this before, probably more than once, but when it comes to getting information before it's officially confirmed, there's always a possibility that those plans can be changed, they can be pulled, they can be delayed. So oftentimes I think this happens and a lot of people hear about these reports and then they don't come true in the way they say, and so a lot of people just assume that it's just another sort of bogus rumor, right? But I wouldn't say that's what this is. Like, this is legitimate in my opinion. It's really just a matter of when, not if. And it's a little strange because if we don't actually get this new Switch actually announced before E3, then what was the whole reasoning behind saying that they wanted to announce it beforehand? Because there are going to be games showcasing the power of the Switch during their presentations. Like, that's the part that really gets at me. Because, yeah, even if it's coming out in October, they could announce this thing in, like, August and probably still be fine, theoretically. I hope they don't wait that long, but, I'm just saying, like, they could. And it could potentially work out. But, I actually went back and I looked at an old Bloomberg report about Switch Lite. And they were right. Switch Lite came that year, but the timing was a little off. And I could be mistaken here, but when I was reading, they were suggesting that the Switch Lite could come out by July. Switch Lite actually came out in September. So the timing was a little off there, right? Mm-hmm. So they're saying September to October, but what if they're a little bit off from what they're hearing and it ends up coming out, say, like December? Which I feel like would be really late for hardware to come out. But
definitely too late, yeah.
A little bit late, but, I feel like they definitely want to get it out before Black Friday. But I'm just saying the timing could be a little off. And even if it's not off with the release timing, maybe it's off with the announcement timing, right? So they did give us a window September to October. I am personally predicting a late October release alongside Breath of the Wild 2. I understand most people do not believe that's going to happen. We shall see. I'm totally aware of the possibility that it could be coming out later, but my prediction is still for like a late October release, Breath of the Wild 2, Switch Pro. But anyway, going back to the point though, it is strange that we haven't gotten an announcement yet, but there is still time. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen Friday. It could just all you have to do is upload a 2 to 3 minute trailer, similar to how they did for like that first look trailer for the Switch back in October of 2016, I want to say. or the one they did for the Switch Lite back in 2019. It's just a trailer they have to drop, and then everything else will just go according to plan. So we'll see.
Line, yeah.
One idea I have, and it's just an idea, I don't know at all, but like it kind of makes sense in a way for them to drop the trailer tomorrow, because that could kick off like all the E3 sort of celebrations and such, and Nintendo could sort of have the beginning and the end, and that might work out really, really well for them. So, you know, maybe that's what they're planning. I don't know. I feel like Nintendo does a great job of prolonging announcements as long as possible, because the Direct announcement happened last week, but we expected it weeks beforehand. Why did they wait so long? Because it's Nintendo, I guess. They do it and no one else does. They're masters of prolonging announcements.
Yeah, and they have like this weird, kind of impressive confidence, I think, with how they protect their information and when it feels like they let that information go out there. And obviously, like any big company in this space is that way with all of their information and announcements, but you know, trying not to sound like a Nintendo fanboy, even though I very much am a Nintendo fanboy, it just seems like the way Nintendo does it just feels a little bit more unique and more like they just have a specific plan. It's got a feel to it. And so when it comes to like the Switch Pro thing and the announcement, I mean, I most of everything you bring up obviously makes sense to me and I agree with, and you know, a lot of us have talked about and stuff on our own channels. I'm definitely, you know, tending to believe that the thing is real after this two-year journey or so we've been on with it so far. It feels like this year is the time. I admit that I was pretty bought into the Bloomberg reports, and like you said, IGN and Eurogamer ended up kind of backing up those reports and reporting on it and saying that this could be happening. And I very much was like, yeah, dude, I kind of think like I've really come around to just believing the thing is real. That's the first thing you have to do is, do you even think Nintendo's making a new Switch revision? And I very much definitely did the past couple months. And then it's like, okay, well, yeah, I guess they're going to do their E3 plans and the Switch Pro announcement before E3, which is an exciting prospect because going into the Direct, even with that tweet, this is also something, again, I brought up in the last conversation with Dave. Like, when you look at all that stuff, there's a great chance that they were just going to announce the hardware to just get the hardware announcement out of the way and then be able to use that to their advantage during the E3 Direct by featuring gameplay and featuring the definitive version of XYZ game on that new hardware. The idea of third-party companies doing the same thing, which you mentioned too, is very, very real sounding to me. Like, that's what they're going to want to do. Like, if Rockstar says, okay, we're going to bring Grand Theft Auto 5 to your console because you're making a Switch Pro, then they're going to be like, that's what we want featured. That's what we're allowing you to show, or however they would work that deal out. So it just all kind of comes together in such a way. As far as them announcing it beforehand, I don't know, man. Yeah, I mean, I guess here's the thing. I will say, kind of like you said, tomorrow to me is probably the last chance I would possibly believe it could happen beforehand. I might be wrong, but it just doesn't feel like a Friday announcement. It feels like a tomorrow, Thursday kind of thing. So maybe we wake up tomorrow and, you know, an hour before this thing gets posted to my YouTube channel, they announce that it's real, and then we'll have that fun mess to deal with. But it'll also be very exciting because then the thing could be real. And again, how it all potentially influences their E3 presence and their Direct, and even maybe the Treehouse. I mean, that is what's really, really exciting to me. Do you think, I'll ask you this, do you think that if, let's pretend, in a perfect world, it is announced tomorrow or Friday, and so we know it exists before the Direct, do you think that they would be doing that because they would want to heavily feature gameplay of the Switch Pro in the Direct, or do you feel, based on how they worded the tweet, that they still, even if the Pro existed, they're not going to talk about it, they're just going to focus on the games and not even go near the hardware thing? Because, and last thing before I let you go, is I just wonder if they're not being totally truthful, because we know that's something Nintendo likes to do. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. What do you think?
So I think if their tweet ends up sounding a little bit misleading after the fact, it'll be because there'll be a lot of Switch trailers that'll make mention of Switch Plus or whatever that name ends up being. just saying, oh, there's this Switch enhanced, this game is enhanced for the Switch revision. Like there'll be mentions of that in the different trailers. And that's pretty much it. I don't expect them to show off hardware during the Direct. Now, if they did, like, what if that's like how they open up the Direct and they throw everyone for a massive curveball because they literally would have just done exactly what they said that they wouldn't do? Then you know, that would be. I mean, I'd be okay with it, even though they would have lied to us, because I want to see the revision and it'd be a kind of a real hype way to get things started. But I don't expect that. I expect them to mostly be honest with what they're saying. Like, I think the reason why they say mostly in 2021 and why they feel the need to say these things is because they want to set an expectation, but also because that they want to set that expectation because to some extent I do think Nintendo wants to be somewhat honest with us because they want to control the narrative a little bit, the response a little bit. They don't want there to be a lot of angry backlash because that doesn't look good for them, right? Sometimes it might work out well for them, but, you know, in general, backlash is not great, right? So, you know, there's that. But I just feel like it makes sense to have it announced beforehand if there's gonna be showcases of games looking better. But there's another sort of consideration here. The majority of Switch owners are going to be base Switch owners or Switch Lite owners. I feel like whatever this revision ends up being, it's going to be quite an uphill battle for it to be taking like a majority part of the fan base in terms of people who own that system. So most Switch fans aren't even going to be able to play these games in this sort of better looking version. So how much do they really want to showcase that during a Direct? They may alienate a lot of fans. So that's kind of one thing to maybe consider here. Maybe they don't really want to double down on the Switch revision marketing here in a Direct because, well, that will upset fans. And I guess another consideration here is maybe with the reports from Bloomberg and such, the whole idea of Switch revision being shown off beforehand for third parties, maybe that's being overblown. Maybe that's not that big of a deal either. And this revision is going to be announced afterwards. There will be enhanced versions, but it's not going to be like that noticeable or that big of a difference. And maybe that's just it. And maybe it's just not going to be announced till later on. And we're just going to have to wait. And a lot of people are going to say that the Switch Pro is fake for like a month or two from now until it's announced. But that may end up happening.
I mean, it's just this everlasting roller coaster. You know, I've referred to it as a roller coaster so many times about what's happening with it. And that's such good points, and really good points, too, about potentially alienating people who won't be able to get their hands on a Switch Pro by saying, here's the best version of Breath of the Wild 2 that only 1% of you will play before the year's over because it's going to be impossible to find and all this. But at the same time, I think the level of hype it generates might be still seen as worth it from a business sense. And so do they really lose either way? Tough to say. It's just, I mean, it comes down to if the thing is real. It comes down to what the thing actually does. You know, again, we don't even know if it's real, what it's supposed to do, and how much of a difference it's supposed to make. It could make a barely noticeable difference. It could make a massive difference. And there's varying levels of, I think, excitement that we all have about it regardless. And then as we were talking about, it also depends on when they would announce it. I'm pretty sure that the Switch Lite, I feel, was announced in July. I'm hoping I'm right. Like, it was about 2 months lead time. I think it was announced in July and then it came out in September. So in a world where maybe October was the time that this thing was supposed to come out, then that would be what? An August reveal, which would of course be way after this E3. So it gets messy. It gets really hard to put together, and we just have to wait and see at this point. It's like, it's either going to show up tomorrow or Friday, or it's going to show up sometime later, or there's the slight possibility it shows up never. And maybe this whole thing has been for naught, and we've all been duped, which is possible, and the thing just isn't real. And what if Nintendo's watching from behind closed doors, like, man, the internet is so dumb because they think this is real and we're not making it.
I don't believe that.
And neither do I. I'm with you, man. Neither do I. But you never know, right? We don't know.
You never really know. I'll tell you that if it ends up being the case that the Switch Pro is fake, then I will have to reassess a lot of things. Like, there's a number of reasons why I believe it is real. and I'd be shocked otherwise, like absolutely shocked otherwise.
Yeah.
But, you know, the other thing is it could be real and maybe it's canceled. Like, that's more likely than it being fake. Not saying it's getting canceled or anything like that, but, you know, there's that to consider. Like, maybe this revision isn't absolutely necessary for Nintendo, right? So maybe it doesn't happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but maybe I sort of what I really want to do is sort of transition to sort of thinking like what this revision is. Like, maybe it's not something that would alienate fans that much. Like, maybe it's something that, yeah, it makes games look and run better, but not to such a significant degree that people feel like splurging $400 to play the better version for. Like, maybe it basically just takes what you know, upscales it to 4K, it looks a little nicer, a little crisper on your 4K television, and that's pretty much it. Maybe if a game has a dynamic resolution, it'll run a little bit higher. Maybe games will have a more solid frame rate. Maybe there'll be a few games will be updated to have a 60 FPS mode, and that'll be it. Which to me would be wonderful, right? But it also may not be enough to sort of make a lot of fans feel alienated, because for a lot of people, that's not even that noticeable of a difference.
Yeah. I go back and forth on the idea of how much it could alienate people. I think it's a worthy thing to consider. And we've seen evidence of how fans can react to that from all companies, not just Nintendo, like everyone. I think I'm more of the belief right now that I think that too many people want the promise of a Switch Pro, even the biggest, most diehard Nintendo and Switch fans. Too many people already are bought in on the concept that I think that when everyone would see that the thing is actually real, even if it's hard to find, even if it's like I can't afford one yet or whatever, I don't know if the majority sentiment, I don't even know if the vocal minority sentiment would actually be that they feel alienated. I mean, you're going to get some of that, of course, just because the law of average says there's that many people. Some people are going to be upset about it, but sure. I feel like they would know they'd have basically a safe and bona fide hit of an announcement with the Switch Pro, especially if it does some fairly significant stuff. I think that the most backlash they would get is if it's a minor upgrade that makes no real immediate difference, because then people are just going to be upset that it's not worthwhile and it's not what they wanted. But if this thing does some fairly significant upgrades, whether it's just improving resolution and frame rate, or if it's something, you know, like I talk about all the time, where it's a leap in power to the point of being close to like a next-gen leap, so you can maybe get third-party games that are on par with PS5 and Series X, those are the kinds of things that I think people would be like, well, I can't afford it now, but this is what I've wanted, so now I know that I'm going to try to get this one. I do agree with you that there's probably no chance that it would have the a length of time on the market to become the dominant Switch SKU between the three before the Switch's life is over. I think Nintendo would be moving next-gen way before, because it would have to sell like 90 million units just of that, you know,
right,
to overtake the 90 million base ones.
Yeah, it would have the Switch would have to become the best-selling console of all time by a long shot in order for that to become a reality. Yeah. Yeah. And that's not to say that, because I agree with that point, but I'm just curious here. Do you think that this Switch revision will become the main version in terms of marketing and branding, and the base Switch will be phased out, kind of like how the new 3DS was? Do you think that's going to happen? Okay. I
do think that, and it's for two reasons. One is because it was part of the Bloomberg report recently, and that, you know, I believe most of what that was saying, and so that's just one of the elements I believe, that it's a SKU replacement. The other reason I believe it is because it really just makes sense. It's just the smarter call to do. Unless I would say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna amend this. I still think it's true, but I think it's true if it's either the small or the mid-tier kind of upgrade, right? If this, you know, if it is like this crazy next-gen leap in power kind of thing, like the way Xbox One X and PS4 Pro was, where they were like kind of more significant leaps, I don't think it would. I think because then you would have to sell it for way too much money to do that. But if it's just, you know, a new 3DS kind of thing, they sell it for $299, or a slightly more significant change that they could sell for like $350, I could see that becoming the SKU replacement, like the report states. Like, it just makes too much sense. But if this thing has to sell for $400 or more, I don't know if I see them making it the actual SKU replacement. And I know that, the counter to that could be like, whoa, the Switch Lite is out there. But I don't actually think that they would let that be the two options, just the $400 version or the Switch Lite. I think they would still want that $300 base one. So overall, yes, I do think that they would make it the base, the standard one that you would find in retail. So are you feeling the same? What are your thoughts?
In my brain, I've sort of assumed the max price of the system has to be $400. So like
max,
the max. And I feel like it could go one of two ways depending on what the spec range is of the system, right? Like if this ends up being, maybe like you said, like more like a PS4 Pro level of upgrade power, and a lot of Switch games can run at 4K, and there's a lot of like 60 FPS modes and things of that nature, and it does other cool little things. Maybe they can swing that 400, right? Especially if there are some like next gen third-party games that can run, right? That can run on the system. Like if it's to that extent, then okay, then maybe they can do 400. And if that's the case, then you have base Switch for 300 and Switch Lite for 200, and eventually, maybe it's phased out. But I guess that's where it gets tricky, because with such a big price differential, how do you phase it out? So if they actually end up going with 350 instead, I actually could see that being something that would make more sense in a way that could allow this base Switch to eventually be phased out. Because what if they go for a thing where it's like, okay, the new Switch is 350, and then the base Switch at that point you can't sell it for 300. So either A, you get it out of the market, or it's dropped down to 250. And then Switch Lite maybe at that point is dropped down to 150. And if they push those kinds of prices, Switches will be flying off the shelves whenever they are available, and whatever sort of like target Nintendo has, they're gonna get to it as long as they can produce the hardware to be sold. Like I think if they do price drops like that sort of pricing structure, 150, 250, 350, maybe they could get above 150 million Switches sold lifetime. Like I could see that happening if they were to hit that kind of price range. And then eventually, maybe a year or so from now, that 250 range Switch is taken out, and then it becomes the 150, 350, or maybe the Switch Lite isn't dropped down that much and price is more like a 180. Or maybe we see a price drop to the Switch Revision 2 years down the road, and then at that point it is just 300 and you have the Switch Lite at 150 or something. Like something like that I could see sort of happening, but this wouldn't happen immediately. It would happen over time.
Yeah, it would take a couple years to roll that stuff out, so it will be exciting to see. I want to move on a little bit from the Switch Pro so we don't make this too crazy long. You and I have this incredible ability to tangent on one topic forever, which is awesome. I love that. But I want to try to keep this under at least 5.5 hours. So, which as much as I would love to do that. Yeah, 5 hours. And there's so much to talk about with Switch Pro. Like I'm actually thinking about more stuff, but it's like, nope, I have to zip it.
I know you want to move on. Can I mention one quick thing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Go ahead, man. It's fine.
So I just feel like it's worth noting that we are currently about 4.5 years into the Switch's life cycle, right? Because it came out March 2017. Yeah, we're past that point. We're past the 4-year anniversary. So in the past, the normal life cycle for a Nintendo system was 5 years. So if this Switch Revision ends up being kind of such a substantial upgrade that it has to be maybe even $400, and it does maybe alienate fans to some extent because of the visual upgrades, maybe we shouldn't be that upset about it, because at that point it's already time for like the next system. Like the Wii U lasted 4.5 years, and a lot of us were glad to move on to the Switch, right? So given the amount of time it's been, maybe it isn't an issue for Nintendo to have such an upgrade, and they won't be worried about alienating fans because of the amount of time it's been out on the market.
Well, oh boy. Well, now you're opening up a great can of worms here, because you're delving into a very passionate topic for me. This falls in line with so many things I've been talking about for probably around a year. That I've been a big proponent that like the Switch probably won't last quite as long as a lot of people think, and that sooner than most people are predicting, Nintendo might consider releasing something that is next gen. Then when these Switch Pro things really started to pick up the last couple of months and it started to make sense, that's when I started to think, and I made a video about this, like a theory really, like, hey, depending on what this thing could be, if it's powerful enough, it could almost pseudo-act like Nintendo's next generation jump. Basically a system that's still a Switch. It's not going to be called Switch 2, but it can play third-party games that are on par or close to on par with PS5 and Series X that the regular Switch can't do. But because it plays regular Switch games, it's got a backwards compatible feel, and so all of this is to say it would be a way for them to basically jump a generation without actually jumping a generation, even though I also think that that's on the table in the next probably 2 years or so. And so the point you bring up does definitely resonate with me. It makes a lot of sense. I think that there is a chance. I think that it would have to be a pretty significant power jump, though, to do that. Obviously, and to me, the biggest thing is exclusive games. If it plays games that the regular Switch cannot play, if there's enough of a power difference for that, and that's where you see Mortal Kombat 12 and Grand Theft Auto 6 or whatever, then to me, I don't care what Nintendo calls it, it's next gen. And they get to do two things at once. They get to go next generation, and they get to commit to the this line that everyone loves to point out, like, oh, Kimishima said 10 years for the Switch. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, he did basically say essentially that, and it's true. So if they call it like, the Super Switch Plus, like we talk about, but the thing can play games that the PS5 and Series X can play, even though we know it wouldn't be exactly on par. There's going to be a disparaging difference between them. But if it can do that, and the regular Switch can't, then, like you say, it maybe removes some of that alienation because it just ends up feeling like this was the call. Like, the Switch has been going for a long time. At some point in the next couple of years, the sales are going to slow down. They need to be able to have a plan for next gen sooner than later. I think that I still probably more bank on it not on the Switch Pro not being this, but there is a chance that it is. And if it is, it kind of satisfies all of these different theories that I'm talking about and you're talking about, and a lot of these concerns that other people has.
No
it could
one's
be a
wrong.
very
Everyone's
smooth way.
right.
Yeah, I don't know. Am I wrong? Like, I kind of feel like it creates that situation. It becomes really smooth. Like, do you think or no?
It's just kind of, it gets me more eager to see what this is, because
Just what is
there
it,
are
man?
a
Yeah.
lot of potential implications. We're looking at a situation where, like, we may not even see like a Pokemon Presents this year at this point, because it may still be like announced tomorrow. We'll see. But normally we see a Pokemon Presents before an E3, and that's not happening this year. And the reason I bring that up, because it may not sound related, is just because when we like to sort of kind of like look at history to predict what's going to happen, but we could be looking at a situation where the pattern is going to change. So that's kind of why I'm really excited to see what this is, because maybe it is kind of like a pseudo next generation leap for Nintendo, but at the same time a mid-gen refresh. It's a hybrid of a hybrid.
Yes, it's a hybrid.
Exactly. Maybe that's what they call it, Nintendo Switch Hybrid, which would just, I'd actually love that.
Interesting. It sounds kind of cool, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, but it's cool. But I guess the point is like, if they were to do that, then at that point, what would be interesting is, yes, they could play like modern third-party games and base Switch can't. But also, Nintendo games, like all Nintendo published products for the most part, we would assume, are still going to be compatible with base Switch for a while. And we may be getting to a sort of scenario where Nintendo is becoming more like Apple, or just like phone manufacturers in general, where like you have a phone, there's a new update every year. Not saying Nintendo would do a new update every year, but
Yeah, I would hope not. Yeah.
Consistent upgrades every couple years, right? And then what happens is that after a while, that initial model that came out like 8 years ago, they'll have an announcement saying, hey, this one will no longer be compatible with new software that comes out after this date. So maybe that's what they do. Right? Maybe Switch Plus comes out this year, say October, right? And then 4 years from now, they'll make an announcement saying that, hey, if you have the base Switch model, it will no longer be able to play Nintendo games. And people may complain, but at that point, the Switch will have had games for like 8 years, right? But Switch Plus will still be able to get the new Nintendo games for 4 more years after that, and also have like an 8-year cycle. And by doing this, basically Nintendo can sort of like refresh their hardware like every 2 years, stay relevant. And, that may happen. That's, like, not impossible. It will be very different for how Nintendo and how game companies as a whole sort of operate, but it is how phone companies operate nowadays, right? So why can't Nintendo do that too?
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, they definitely could. It's not crazy. I think a lot of us have talked about or heard about the kind of phone or the Apple comparisons for a while.
Yeah.
I think with just consoles in general, I think the first time I even heard that comparison might have had to do more with the Xbox. But it definitely could make it's one of those things where it's like it could make sense. I could almost see it happening, but I also could never see it happening.
Yeah.
Would Nintendo be the one company out of the three to maybe try to adopt it first? Possibly, because there's some interesting synergy with them having a portable device as opposed to the other two guys who just have actual, only home consoles. It's interesting. I mean, at some point companies change, so maybe that would be the way that Nintendo would choose to change. I don't know if I'm yet ready to believe that. So
let me make an additional argument for that. Like my brain just like
Okay.
I'm not even sure I believe this myself. Just for the record, I don't know if people sometimes understand when I talk about things. I'm not talking about necessarily because I believe it. It's just I like to sort of play hypotheticals, and maybe I believe it, maybe I don't, right? But continuing on with this idea, though, right? Like, what if maybe the reason Nintendo would do this is because the Switch itself is so successful? Why did Apple continue with the iPhone? Because it was incredibly successful, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
Game-changing.
Nintendo wants to do everything they can to take advantage of the Switch situation, because if they do a Switch 2, or whatever they decide to call it, it's not guaranteed to be as successful as a Switch, but if they just continue to iterate on the Switch hardware, they kind of know that it's going to do well. So what if they just kind of continue this train as long as they can? And if we look at it from a scenario, like if the Switch ends up being, if the idea is right, and it ends up being the case that 4 years from now, that they will continue to do like mid-gen refreshes, but to the point where they're no longer mid-gen refreshes, right? The base Switch will still get gains for 8 years, which is not bad. Like if previous Nintendo hardwares would only get gains for like 5 or 6 years, fans shouldn't really complain, right? But still, Nintendo is moving on to next generations without not just doing it in one go. And so I feel like both sides would actually win out like this, because if you bought a Switch in 2017, it would still play games until 2025, new games that are coming out. So I don't know. I think it could work, but obviously that's just one of a few different possibilities.
Yeah, it's a compelling argument for sure. It's an interesting idea, and with Nintendo more than anyone, it's like you just don't write ideas like this off, no matter how crazy they sound. I think when I think about it being something Xbox ventures into doing in the next couple of years, I could see a world where they do it. Where it's Nintendo doing it, I could see a world where they would do it. It just one of these companies is probably going to make a decision potentially very much like this down the road, like as hardware feels less and less relevant and it's all about software and it's all about digital, like you can kind of get away with doing stuff like this. And so I don't know, it's gonna be interesting, man. It's kind of like what we said a little bit ago. It just comes down to the first step even to this is, are they making a Switch Pro revision? And then it's, what does it do? How big of a change? How much does it add? What games does it play? What's the price, the release? How does it affect the current SKUs? Like just these same elements that we're all so curious about right now, those could potentially be the beginning breadcrumbs on that path to Nintendo doing something like that. I mean, it's just, I don't know. It could be crazy. It's exciting. I would love to wake up tomorrow and see that they announced it just so we know what it is. Even if it's the least exciting version of it, it's gonna finally feel real and tangible. It'll give us a window into their business model, the way they're thinking, the products that they're interested in making, how it's going to affect their E3 and beyond. So it would undo a huge chunk of this conversation because all of our theorizing wouldn't matter anymore if we woke up tomorrow and whatever it is was real. But I think it would be worth it just for us to be able to talk about it. So we're gonna put a pin in the Switch Pro thing because it's so easy. I almost wish we just made a whole podcast about this. Actually, maybe we should do that after E3 if it's not real.
Yeah,
but I
sure.
do want to go. I do want to go back to focusing kind of more specifically on E3 and what might be there. And I want to actually focus on the games. There's a couple of specific ones that are obviously hot topic conversations that we're all talking about and hoping for. To me, there's 4 main ones. At least these are the 4 that I find the most potentially interesting, not counting surprises. This is just based on conversation that already exists. And to me, it's obviously Zelda, it's obviously Metroid, it's Bayonetta, and it's Donkey Kong. To me, those are kind of the 4 big Nintendo first-party games that are the most exciting to me. Well, Bayonetta is not first-party, I should say, but they're the 4 big exclusive kind of games that I think could potentially have a presence and have a lot of weight as far as what Nintendo does at their E3 Direct. So I don't know. I've been debating if it's like, oh, just go through like each series and just kind of talk about it or not. I think what I want to do is, and again, on this last conversation with Super Metal Dave, we spent a section talking about Zelda, but I still want to talk about Zelda. And I know you and I have mostly similar thoughts, I think, on Zelda's presence at the show. It's a big conversation. It is still a debate. People are very divided on if they think Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out this year or next year or even later. If it's going to get announced and then delayed, is it going to be at the Direct? Is it not? Will it be at the Treehouse? Will it be all of the Treehouse? Will it not be there? Skyward Sword exists, so maybe they won't even announce Zelda this year. But it's the 35th anniversary, so maybe Breath of the Wild 2 will get announced. It's just, there's a trillion thoughts about it. I've obviously shared mine many times on my channel. Everyone's heard. What do you think, man? I mean, I know, again, we have some similar opinions, but how do you feel about Zelda specifically having a presence, just at E3, in the Direct, in the Treehouse? Do you feel like it's going to have some sort of presence?
I'll tell you that I would be very, very surprised if we do not see any sort of Zelda announcement during the Direct. There's gonna be something. Even if it's not something great, there will at least be some mention. I remember there was a lot of speculation that we would get like an anniversary announcement back in February. On my channel, I made several videos about it, talking about it then. And while we didn't get an official announcement, if you look at the February Nintendo Direct and you just sort of do the numbers, Zelda was talked about more than any other franchise during that presentation. We got the Skyward Sword Joy-Con announcement, Skyward Sword HD itself, the Age of Calamity DLC, and a promise, or at least news from Age of New, saying that there was a plan to provide more details for Breath of the Wild 2 later this year. So even though they didn't officially say that they were going to celebrate the Zelda 35th anniversary, they had several Zelda announcements during that Direct, which was 2 days removed or something from the actual anniversary time, which to me, it was like a soft announcement for the Zelda anniversary without actually saying that they were going to celebrate the anniversary. But I think, based off what we're hearing as of today, that we actually are going to get some sort of announcement for Zelda's anniversary. And I could be mistaken.
Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
No, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to kind of jump into the whole Revelation thing, but go ahead for a minute, and yeah,
sure.
Go for it.
I mean, it's possible that what I'm about to talk about isn't true, or I mean, I think it is true, but I guess what I'm getting at here is that it's relation to the GameStop situation, right? Like, we're seeing posters surfacing in different places. Apparently, GameStop staff is going to be doubled on June 15th. People are hearing that something Zelda's coming up, and there'll be other things, apparently, not just Nintendo Zelda stuff, but just other things, but the thinking has been that there's going to be some sort of announcement or something that's going to require that GameStop is ready with people at hand, and there are Zelda anniversary posters that are circulating. Now, these Zelda posters don't have like a 3.5 on it necessarily, but they look like they're very clearly celebrating the history of the series, so I just have to wonder, is this just GameStop doing something on their own in anticipation of what they think Nintendo will do? Or is this actually like a hint, like actual true hint that Nintendo is going to actually officially acknowledge Zelda's 35th anniversary during this Direct? I'm inclined to say that it is actually a hint towards the actual 35th anniversary, but I'm considering both sides here. But either way, I definitely expect there to be Zelda stuff. And I'd be very surprised if we don't see Breath of the Wild 2 mentioned to some degree. I think when AJ was talking about details for Breath of the Wild 2, this was the date. June 15th was the date that he had in mind. It's gonna be the biggest show of the year for Nintendo. So yeah, this is the time to probably bank on a Zelda reveal. Yeah, I mean, before I jump into the GameStop thing, specifically on Breath of the Wild 2, obviously, repeating points I've made, I kind of agree with you there. I just think that it makes way too much sense for them to focus on that game this year. Granted, for myself,
one of the main reasons I say that is because I also think the game is coming out probably this year, but bare minimum, I think it's coming out before next E3. You know, people throw out this March 22 date, and it's like, yeah, sure, it could happen, I guess, in March next year in the first quarter. But even if it does that, it's still before E3 again. And so that makes this E3 the last opportunity to see that game. So
makes sense.
In a world where it basically comes out between now and next year's E3, I just think they're going to talk about it. And it is the 35th anniversary. I have personally believed that they're going to celebrate it and acknowledge it this year. And then we learned E3's coming back, Nintendo's a part of it. Okay, well, if that's happening, then why wouldn't they also talk about the Breath of the Wild 2 and the 35th anniversary at E3? And you even brought up the Skyward Sword reveal during the February Direct, and that to me further said the same thing. A lot of people were kind of disappointed with that whole thing, and to me, I was like, you guys, I feel like this is a positive sign. We went into this year waiting for Zelda things thinking it's the 35th anniversary, we're going to get all this stuff. And the first Direct they gave us, they acknowledged the Zelda franchise and even announced the game. And also, Andres, as you mentioned, that he even said Breath of the Wild 2 is being made. We'll talk about it later. So my takeaway from that whole thing was positive. That was very much a sign of the 35th anniversary, like you said. I agree with you on that. So this is all a very long way for me to say that I absolutely expect to see Breath of the Wild 2 at the Direct and hopefully at the Treehouse. And I would love to learn the date and hope that it's actually this year, or at least early, quarter one next year. And then this kind of brings me more to kind of add on to what you talked about. And this is what, in the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned to you guys that Andres filled me in on this kind of new revelation that happened today while I was actually working, that there is this GameStop info that seems to be going around. Again, repeating what Andres had already said, that on Monday or Tuesday the 15th, the date of Nintendo's Direct, that maybe GameStop is asking more employees to be available and to be staffed. And the big thing is the picture of the posters, and I'm going to kind of feature that here too so you guys can see it if you haven't. And yeah, you're totally right, dude. Like, it very much seems like it's celebrating the entire lineage and history of Zelda. And, as we talked about before we went live, you can see GameStop stuff in the background. So could it be fake? Absolutely. But could it be real? Yes, it could be real. I used to work at GameStop as a manager way back in the day. So, I saw a little bit of this throughout the day while I was working, but then Andres filled me in on more details before we went live. And so even as we've been podcasting here, I've been kind of running this through my head with my experience as a GameStop assistant manager, which granted was in the early 2000s, so we're talking sixth generation. So I know things have changed since then, but I still have some insight into how the company works. And I do know that they very much, at least at my day, they did this, and I'm sure they still do it. They communicate very specifically to the managers and the staff of each store. Back in my day, they actually did it literally with a physical email that you had to download from the DOS computer system and then print out. And you had to read the printed version of the email. This is like 2002. And I'm sure nowadays they're just sending emails and it's touchscreen and it's fine. It's normal. And so I could see a world where this could be real, because they might say, okay, here's our plan. Here's a big thing happening. It's E3. Nintendo's doing the new Zelda. It's on this date. So we want every store to be prepared. So I could see them doing that. And then the poster thing to me is fascinating because in a world of social media, I find that to be so risky, which is one of the things that makes me kind of think it might not be real, even though I'm still leaning towards believing it. It's just, we just don't know. So as I analyze it now as fresh information, real or fake, one of the things that makes me think it might not be real is just how obvious it would be that this would get out there. You have thousands of GameStop stores and thousands of employees, and everyone's got a Twitter account and a cell phone. Like, people are going to take pictures of this and put it online, as we're seeing in these photos. So this could be confirmation it's real, because of course it's real. It could be confirmation that someone could fake it because it would be so easy. Would Nintendo let this stuff get out there knowing it would spoil the surprise close to a week before their E3 Direct? Tough to say. So it is exciting.
Let me add a couple things, actually.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
So, like, it could be fake, I guess. I don't think it's fake. But what something that is interesting, though, is that you look at the posters, and I've seen multiple photos of the poster, not just it's coming from different places, the poster. which is another reason why I think it's more likely to be real. But what's interesting about the poster, though, is that there's nothing in the poster that's new. It's just like a different composition of different things we've seen before.
Link and,
right, like it's
true.
all, it's not, there's no new renders here, right? Like in theory, someone could have just created this on Photoshop and printed it out with a really nice printer. Like in theory, that could have been done. I think it's official, but I also don't think it's like, I think this is one of those things where maybe Nintendo was okay with this theoretically being leaked because there's nothing new on here. It's just like some celebratory stuff, which also, it kind of goes back to what I was suggesting earlier, how maybe this is just a GameStop thing, right? In anticipation of what Nintendo might do, you know what I mean? Like maybe this isn't like something that Nintendo's like, hey, we're giving you these specific posters for this day. Maybe that's the case, but it's also maybe not the case, you know? I guess my point is that it's also possible, and I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, but it's also possible that Nintendo allowed this to happen because it's okay if it gets
generate
out.
Hype. Yeah, generate hype.
It's not actually spoiling anything. It's just spoiling, okay, they're going to talk about Zelda during the Direct. Oh, who couldn't have figured that one out? Like, so, you know, I don't think it's that big of a deal this is getting out there. It all it really suggests is that Nintendo's going to talk about Zelda and celebrate its history during the Direct, which was something that pretty much everyone expected already. There's no new renders on these posters. It's all old renders put together. So it's exciting. What it does suggest is that maybe there are some pre-orders we could maybe get on June 15th, which throws me into a whole, I don't know what, because there's just possibilities, right? Like Switch Pro, Breath of the Wild 2, I don't know. But there's definitely something going on.
To me, this is the kind of thing, like, as a pre-order bonus, which it almost for sure would be, this is the kind of thing where it's like, hey, you know, here's your Ocarina of Time Majora's Mask collection and get a free poster. Because this is the one celebrating, like you said, the imagery is just very much celebrating the entire history of the Zelda franchise. And it definitely makes sense, man. Like, I mean, it's exciting. Don't get me wrong. Like, I've got plenty of devil's advocate kind of thoughts in my brain, like I mentioned about why it could be fake. Not to mention, we have seen some really elaborate hoaxes in the past. All you got to do is look at the 3D printed Nintendo NX touchscreen controller, or the Rayman leak, or the kid that made all those fake profiles coding into the Nintendo Switch OS to show all those online profiles before the online, and he was like navigating the menus with the sounds. Like, so, you know, a simple piece of paper with some Zelda pictures on it, boy, it could be fake. But it kind of does feel a little bit more real than fake. I am with you there, you know, and having worked at GameStop, it's like I can also see how they would have even wanted to communicate this days ahead of time. And a great point about Nintendo maybe just not caring if it gets out there, because no new games shown here, like you said, and it could just be a fine... It's almost like one of those controlled leaks. Like, they're like, yeah, let that get out there, man. We want people to get excited and hyped for Zelda stuff at E3. Like, it kind of could all work in their favor as marketing. So it's definitely cool. It's really, you know, thank God we had something kind of new and fresh to talk about on this podcast, because we're talking about the same stuff we've been talking about for weeks and weeks. So yeah, I guess, you know, to just double down on the Zelda thing, I definitely expect it at E3. It sounds like you expect it as well. Let me ask you, one last thing before we move on to some other games. You do expect Breath of the Wild at the show, it sounds, as do I. What's your overall kind of thought and prediction? I think you even said this earlier, but I want to hear you talk more about when you think Breath of the Wild 2 might come out.
Okay. So I still believe that it's coming out this year. I know most people don't, and that's probably like the toughest thing in terms of continuing to believe that, because if you keep hearing people say one thing, you kind of start to believe what everyone else is saying. But if I just look at all the evidence that's been presented to me and not consider like like other people's opinions on the internet, I have no reason to think that Breath of the Wild 2 is not coming out this year. Like, we're getting several reports from all reliable news sites that Switch Pro is coming out this year. The history of Nintendo releasing hardware and pairing it with Zelda is pretty consistent, and Breath of the Wild 2 kind of makes sense for that. If you look at the fact that Skyward Sword HD is not coming out this holiday, it's coming out this summer, and it's not being branded with the 35th anniversary, which is normally, with the big 5-year anniversary celebrations, are usually done towards the holiday. What is going to take that anniversary sort of logo with its sort of like box art and such? It's not Skyward Sword, it's something else. So all of those things to me sort of point towards Breath of the Wild 2 maybe being ready for the holidays. I've talked about other things about how the game's been developed since 2017, according to interviews and things of that nature. But of course, the difference between an October release and a March release may not be that significant for that, right? So it's hard to say, but because of the Switch revision, because they haven't actually labeled any game for the 35th anniversary game itself yet, and because that October slot is still open, wherein it's a time slot where we're seeing both Luigi's Mansion 3 and Mario Odyssey, both games that have sold over 10 million copies. So it is a time period where Nintendo could push a lot of sales. But another interesting thing that I actually think sort of supports my thinking here is that, yes, we got Legends Arceus confirmed for January, not March. But we also got this leak that Shin Megami Tensei 5 is coming out in November 11th, or like a week before Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. So there's two major games coming out in November, a week apart from each other. Why? To me, that suggests that we're looking at a situation similar to the second half of 2019, where there are about a dozen published Nintendo games coming out in a 5 to 6 month period, or some big third-party games mixed in there as well. In other words, I think we're looking at a situation where we're going to be seeing more than one big game coming out per month on the Switch. So it does open up the possibility where we're going to be seeing a lot of games, and October, I think we could see like a Breath of the Wild 2. Like, that kind of makes sense for me. Maybe December as well. I've heard some people suggest that, but I feel like if we're talking about new hardware coming out alongside of it, October seems like a better fit considering that we're getting Shin Megami Tensei 5 and Pokemon in November.
Yeah, I struggle with the December release for Zelda. That just doesn't feel right to me. I mean, we have seen them highlight some big games in December. Obviously, the last two Xenoblade games released in December. And, to be fair, as weird as it was, Smash Brothers released in December. And clearly, they had no problem selling that game. So, I guess it is kind of, I don't know. Maybe I'm talking myself out of it now that I think about it. Because I'm definitely on board with your October idea. Because, to me, Mario Odyssey set the standard there that Nintendo would take one of their top tier best-selling franchises and put it in the month of October and not November. So I think October could make sense. And I literally started this thought off thinking that December made no sense, but Smash Brothers kind of changed my mind. I actually think the first week of December, you miss Black Friday, but like, will it really matter? I don't think it's going to matter because you still get to get in before Christmas and Christmas Eve and all that stuff.
For a game, yes, but the problem is the hardware situation. If they're gonna be paired together,
if we're tying it to the Switch Pro, and and that's a whole different ball of wax. That is, oof. I mean, I have to try to not tangent myself because I want to go 100 ways with that. And it is, but it is a good point. So I don't want to necessarily completely ignore it. And you mentioned it, and it is worth talking about because if the purpose is Switch Pro is real, it's coming out this holiday, Zelda's meant to release together and highlight it, which I think they tend to do with their hardware, is to release some kind of game with it, then it does make more sense. And yeah, releasing the Switch Pro in December is probably not the best idea. So tough call. I mean, all I know is my personal hard prediction is that I think there's more than a 60% chance Zelda comes out in 2021. So regardless of Switch Pro, regardless of October, November, or December, I just feel like that game is meant to be a big holiday title for this year. And I think that, because I think things are going to start stacking up next year that people don't think about. And part of it is I'm one of the people that thinks Metroid Prime 4 is coming out next year. I think that's the landing date for Prime 4 is 2022. And so I don't know if they need Zelda next year. I think that game has been in development for 4.5, 5 years, using assets in an engine that already do exist. 5 years is a nice, healthy timeline to make that game. I think it's ready this year. So that's just kind of where I'm sort of doubling down on.
It could have made a whole other new Zelda game that had no foundation by this point.
Wait, say it again?
Considering the amount of time it's been since Breath of the Wild, they should have been able to make a whole other new Zelda game without even having a foundation in place. So the fact that this is building off of Breath of the Wild, which should expedite development significantly, you gotta think that they're really close.
Yeah, I so agree with you. And it's so funny that really almost no one agrees with us, dude. Most people think that game is like nowhere near ready to come out in 2021. And of course that could be right. You and I don't know, but it's just surprising no one's considering it the way you and I are.
I'll tell you this. I remember back, this is me kind of flexing a little bit, so I apologize for not being humble.
Here we go. Flex time.
But like, I remember back in early February, January, most people were saying there would not be a Nintendo Direct in February. And I, went against the grain. I was like, but Nintendo needs to make announcements for games. We don't know what's coming out after 3D World. They need to have a Direct. So I think there's going to be a Direct. And they also need to start talking about Zelda things. And what happened? There was a February Nintendo Direct. It was a general Direct, which a lot of people at the time didn't even think would happen. People were doubting the return of the general Direct. It came, and they started talking about Zelda things. Why? Because they needed to start talking about games because we didn't know about much at that point in the year. So I guess the reason that I bring that up is not necessarily to show that, yay, I predicted something that most people didn't, but...
Humble brag.
Yeah, but the real reason is just because we're in a situation right now where we're predicting something that maybe most people are not, right? And it's not to say either side is like stupid. It's just kind of a difference of opinion. Sometimes when the majority thinks something, that doesn't mean it's true, right? Like I think, like what's Albert Einstein, for example, like he had a lot of ideas. Most of the scientific community back in that time was against what he was saying. So the only reason I bring that up is just sometimes I think, even though your opinion not be the most popular, that doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. It could be. You should definitely pay attention to what other people are telling you, but it doesn't mean for sure that it's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, and especially when you just consider that truth in the concept of like the video game industry and Nintendo, who is literally impossible to predict, even though we all spend our lives doing that with our YouTube channels trying to predict them. It's very true. Like, and I think, there's the pressure of the more people seem to say something and agree with it, the more it's comfortable to just say, yeah, that makes sense. I feel the same way. Like, I think we all are a little bit guilty of that. Like, it's human nature to a degree, but sometimes you just look inwardly. You just say, this is how I feel, and you do it. And that's one of the main reasons I've spent a year on my channel putting myself out there, putting myself on the line. Well, not on the line really, but just putting myself out there saying like, they might go next gen sooner than people think, because it's just what I feel. It doesn't mean I'm right, but it also doesn't mean that the 90% of people who disagree with me are right. It's just a matter of whatever's going to happen. And if you're a fan, you just talk about it as a fan, you share your thoughts, and things happen, and some people were right and some people were wrong, and that's usually how it goes,
Yeah. And I really do like the idea that we're kind of both right about the Switch revision, where it's a mid-gen refresh and next-gen at the same time.
It's exciting. It's really exciting for it to be that. So I'm gonna do. We gotta get closer to wrapping this up here. So I'm gonna do something I hate to do, but we're gonna kind of skip past the Metroid, Bayonetta, Donkey Kong stuff. Because I want to focus on two last things real quick. One of them really is the Treehouse. We haven't spent a lot of time actually focusing on specifically the Treehouse. I love that it's coming back. I think it's a huge indicator as to what could be happening, that it is only a 1-day, 3-hour Treehouse event. There's still a lot of options of what that could be, but that changes the game because, as I've said several times, it's different than 3 days. We now only have 3 hours immediately following their 40-minute direct. So I guess I'm just going to kind of ask you, I probably should have prepared you for some of this stuff, but I think you're fine winging it. Do you have any just random thoughts and feelings on how you expect the Treehouse to play out and what you might expect to show up there? Like, we already know you believe Zelda will probably be at the direct like I do. Do you think that's going to be all of the Treehouse, a huge focus? Neither. What do you think about the Treehouse?
I think that it's going to be a bit more concise than previous Treehouse segments, but I also think that it's not going to be that big a deal. It's also 1 day, because if we go back to previous sort of E3s, the first day of Treehouse is the most significant. The other days afterwards, I'm not going to say they're entirely redundant, but there's some maybe redundancy there. So I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. But I also feel like because we're only going to get this 4-hour block of Nintendo information between the Direct and the Treehouse footage, that it sort of opens the door for other things to come afterwards as well, right? Like, who's to say it's the only time we're going to get Treehouse this year? So that's just something else to sort of consider there. But by Nintendo being more concise with maybe their gameplay, so that it'll be fine. Like, maybe Breath of the Wild 2 does get like a bigger sort of like time slot there. Maybe it gets like a 30-minute to 60-minute sort of slot, but then maybe other games like maybe Donkey Kong and Metroid get like a 15-minute slot. And Pokemon will also probably get like probably 2 slots because there's 2 different big Pokemon games coming. But, you know, I think there's room to get all of these, a lot of the major ones out there. I guess one thing to consider is that whatever it is in the Treehouse, it's going to be things that are coming out by the fiscal year. So by March 2022. Anything beyond March 2022, I do not think will be playable in the Treehouse. Could be wrong on that one, but I just feel like because they only have so much time, they got to focus on what's coming within the fiscal year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good and smart prediction. I think you're probably right on with that. I would maybe take it one small step further just for my personal prediction that they might even just focus on the calendar year. I think anything is possible. I think that they definitely wouldn't go for anything releasing after March next year. But I feel like given the weirdness of the year and the E3 and the pandemic and the 4-hour block of Nintendo stuff, the kind of limiting nature, I wonder if they might want to use their smaller time slot to even be more hyper-focused than just the fiscal year. Again, acknowledging that might happen because like there's a great chance, for example, that I could see Splatoon 3 being like the March game, for example. I think that's entirely possible.
I'm glad you agree with me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, do you think the same, that March?
Yeah, I've been thinking March, and it kind of makes sense. It's the kind of game that has the sales potential for that. Splatoon 2 sold over like 12 million, so like Splatoon 3 could definitely be a kind of like fiscal year ending game. But also that kind of makes me kind of hold to the idea that we'll see games by the fiscal year and by the end of the fiscal year being in the Treehouse, because I have a hard time believing that Splatoon 3 won't be in the Treehouse if it is coming out by the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah, and I mean, it's good you say that because that's one of the reasons I was bringing up Splatoon. Is like, A, I think it could be March within the fiscal year, and B, because of that, it could definitely be one of the games featured at the show. Like, there is a great chance that it's meant to be heavily highlighted. But, you know, here's the thing, though. If you and I are wrong, and let's say that game doesn't come out until, like, next August or something,
sure,
then it could make more sense to highlight it at the following E3. So,
right,
you know, all we can do is speculate at this point. But I definitely think it's possible the fiscal year is the focus. I think it's possible for Splatoon 3. But I mostly feel focusing on this year. And also, because I think Zelda has such a heavy focus, I guess I look at the Treehouse and I see 3 ways that the Treehouse could play out. One would be as close to normal as possible, where it's multiple games with short 15 to 25-minute presentations and a couple of minutes intermission to set up between. So you can get maybe somewhere between 5 to 7 or 8 games highlighted in that Treehouse. The other would be if they do less games but longer demos, so maybe 40 minutes to an hour per game, and instead of like 6 or 7 games, they do like 3, 4, or 5 games. The other would be if they do the craziest thing, which I don't think is likely but has the tiniest chance of being possible, which is if Breath of the Wild 2 is this year, they do the entire Treehouse focused on Breath of the Wild 2. Again, I don't expect that. That's like 5% as well I'm putting on that, but I wanted to bring it up as a crazy out there surprise. Like, what if they used that 2016 template for Breath of the Wild and did the same thing for Breath of the Wild 2 this year? But I don't want to focus on that because I don't really think it's going to happen. I think that we're probably going to get a mix between the other two. If there's a 2D Metroid game announced, I agree with you, they're going to show that. If there's a Donkey Kong game announced, they are definitely going to show that. But that's the thing. Who's to say that instead of doing, 6 to 8 games at 15 to 20 minutes apiece, what if they just literally do a huge chunk on Breath of the Wild 2, Metroid, Donkey Kong, and like Mario Golf, for example, because that's a game coming out right away. What if they spend 40 minutes on just those games and that's all they did? How would you feel if they did something like that?
Well, I mean, I'll be frank. I don't want to see Treehouse footage for Skyward Sword or Mario Golf. That may happen, but I guess you could argue that because of the limited amount of time, maybe they will not do that, right? They'll just rely on trailers, and that'll be it for those games. But the newer games where we don't really have a good understanding of what they are, those are the games that actually deserve the Treehouse footage, right? Like, in my ideal world, this is not a prediction necessarily, but just like what I would like to see, because we don't know that much about these particular games. I would like to see Breath of the Wild 2 showcased in the Treehouse. I would like to see the Metroid game, the Donkey Kong game, Splatoon 3, and Legends Arceus, because those are 5 games that we want to learn about how they play. We know how Mario Golf plays, pretty much. We know how Skyward Sword plays, pretty much. Even though Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl we haven't seen that much footage for, it's a remake of an old Pokemon game.
Remake.
We pretty much know what it is already, and there's a good chance we still see footage of that, and there's also a good chance it is featured for the Treehouse. But I'm just saying, in terms of like value, in terms of learning new things, the 5 games I mentioned, I think, deserve the most time during the Treehouse, and potentially something else that we haven't learned about yet that will be announced during the Direct.
A good point with the surprises, man, because that's part of an E3 Direct, is like, what is the game or games we're going to learn about we don't even know about. And it's totally feasible. If you pay attention to, if you pay attention to Nintendo's track record, they will very often announce a game only 5 or 6 months before it's meant to come out. That's exactly what they did with Smash Brothers, right? Like, so it's entirely possible that it's crazy. So it's entirely possible that they announce a fairly huge game, which honestly, we'll use Donkey Kong as an example. Maybe it's that. They announce a Donkey Kong game and it's coming out October this year. And if that's the case, you better believe that specific game would be a huge focus at that Treehouse, right?
I'm kind of curious, actually, right? Because I feel like you're relatively confident in the Donkey Kong thing, right?
I feel good about Donkey Kong, yeah.
Yeah, me too. But the one thing I'm sort of divided on is if it's coming out this year or not. Now, like, sure. I guess, like, I expect the Metroid thing, absolutely. Breath of the Wild 2, I understand it's a toss-up, but I'm going to keep to my prediction, right? Like, Donkey Kong's the one where I want to see it this year. I want to play it this year. But because there's so many other things, like the Pokemons, the Shin Megami Tensei 5s, and other things, maybe like a Fire Emblem or a Mario Party, can it fit in this year, I'm not sure. But, getting to my question, Donkey Kong's 40th anniversary is this year. That's a big deal. Donkey Kong's arguably the most important game in Nintendo history because it's what popularized them in the West. So, do you think Nintendo's going to celebrate that? And do you think they're going to use this Donkey Kong to do that? Or are they not going to care about the anniversary and then Donkey Kong will just come out sometime next year because that's what makes sense for them in terms of sales and marketing and such?
Yeah, it's a good question. I personally lean more towards them celebrating and acknowledging it. I feel like, what's really sad, it's going to be hard for me to admit this, but I actually think that has a slightly better chance of happening than even acknowledging the Metroid anniversary. And I already believe they are going to do that. But let's say someone was like, well, what do you think? Well, if you had to pick one, which are they going to do? I actually kind of think they might do Donkey Kong. Partly for the reason you mentioned. Not only is it really what made them a household video game name and really got them their first big success as a gaming company, it's where Mario came from. It is an important franchise. So to answer your question, I would say, I think Donkey Kong makes probably more sense this year if I was going to guess. And I think it's likely to show up at E3, and I think it's likely to be somehow acknowledged as a 40th anniversary. That's my thought. What do you think? I know you think the game could be next year, but like the anniversary thing, what do you think about that?
Well, like theoretically, they can announce the game and have like a Donkey Kong 99 and and they can acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And actually, a Donkey Kong 99 might be really cool.
It could be cool,
to play like the Red Girder style game, but like remixed in some way. That would be fun. So I think that's a possibility. And also, like, I know there are plans to have the Donkey Kong expansion, but that Donkey Kong expansion is not in for Universal Nintendo World,
you mean for
right?
the theme park? Okay, right, I was about to ask what you mean.
Yeah, I should have clarified. That park, like, they plan on expanding to that, but that's not happening this year, right? So maybe they want to time the Donkey Kong release closer to that, right? So that's something to consider there. Although, you could also, if you look at the way how the mobile games have led to better software sales, right? It's kind of like a similar sort of marketing structure. You put something out there to make the franchise more known, and then when you have something else come out there that is more successful, right? So maybe you want the Donkey Kong game to come out maybe this year, and then by the time this expansion is ready, say a year to 2 from now, Donkey Kong is now more of a household name again, and the Donkey Kong expansion brings in more excitement to the park. So, you can look at it from 2 different perspectives there. So it's hard to say, but I'll tell you this. In my ideal fantasy world, we get Metroid in August or September. No, yeah, we get Metroid in August. We get Donkey Kong in September. We get Switch Pro and Breath of the Wild 2 in October. The Pokemon Shin Megami Tensei thing in November. And then either a new game from Monolith Soft or Bayonetta 3 in December. January is Legends Arceus. February is Twilight Princess Wind Waker HD. And then March is Splatoon 3. And that's how Nintendo closes out the fiscal year. Oh, you've got the whole year.
You got one game a month for the next forever.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Including new hardware.
Yep. That's my ideal sort of situation based off what we sort of heard about right now.
Yeah. I mean, boy, that sounds good. I think what's really kind of interesting about that is I don't know if I'm that optimistic, but to be fair, it's like everything there makes sense too, right? It's like it seems like way too much, way too consistently. Like Nintendo's going to have breaks. However, pretty much every single one of those, except for maybe you mentioned I think a Zelda thing in February. Maybe that's the one thing that feels less right, but everything else it makes sense, you know. And then that's like what 7 months straight of like pretty huge new games. You're getting a new Zelda game and a new Metroid game and a new Donkey Kong game wrapped up in there. Like, that's crazy. And, you know, most of those things probably exist. Several of them we know do exist. And so at that point, the release dates could be anywhere. So a lineup like that doesn't feel super crazy. Like, we know there's 2 Pokemon releases, you know, the remakes and then the Arceus. We know there's a Zelda game. We know there's a Splatoon game. Like, Bayonetta's a game. Like, these things are happening. 35th anniversary Zelda could reveal something like a Wind Waker Twilight Princess, like you said, and so I don't know. It's interesting though because you kind of realize what a far cry it's become from how we felt about Nintendo releases a year ago, right? Where it was a ghost town, and everyone was like doom and gloom. Nintendo Directs are dead. We're never getting any more games. They're being too silent. They're done. You know, no games. It was all about Animal Crossing for literally a whole year. And now here we are, and like we're getting terrified at just the amount of games that are about to get unleashed on us. So, pretty exciting.
I'll say that if we compare what I just said to 2017 or the second half of 2019, it's on par, right? So I don't think it's that crazy. And all of those years line up with hardware releases. Nintendo uses software to support hardware, so I feel like it makes sense from that perspective. But on the flip side, right?
It's a good point.
There's all these games, and if we're wrong and not that many great, exciting games that we want to play are announced and they come out when we want them to, then there is a bright side to this. There'll probably still be a couple that we'll all be interested in, that we'll get to play and enjoy, and we get to save money. And we won't have to buy like 2 games a month, and that'll be it. Well, we'll save money. We'll save money if it turns out all of our predictions are wrong and there's like not that much coming out.
Boy, that is true. But what would still be good about it though is most of these games would still exist. So if they're just more spaced out, it's better for our wallets. But at least we know the games like would still exist. So
yeah,
it kind of becomes a win all around at that point. Yeah. Well, okay. So you know we've gone for way longer than I anticipated, and I do have to kind of wrap up here. So I'm going to end with one last thing. I'm just going to ask you a question. Same thing I asked Dave last time. If you could think of one crazy out there prediction, doesn't have to make sense, doesn't have to be all that likely, but if you were going to do one kind of bold prediction, thought, a surprise thing, what would it be for Nintendo announcing at the show?
So this is not anything that I necessarily actually believe. This is purely a wish. But I would like to see the team that made both ARMS and Mario Kart, who haven't come out with anything since 2017, so they should be ready with something, announce a new F-Zero game. They are the perfect team to do it, I think. They know how to make fast-paced 60 FPS games. They know how to make racing games. They know how to make online-centric multiplayer Nintendo games. They know how to build rosters with a lot of fanciful personalities and such. So I think they are the ideal team to make a modern day F-Zero.
Yeah. Interesting. Boy, would I like that. I just want anyone. I don't care who's making F-Zero. Nike could get into the gaming space and say, we're making an F-Zero game. That's fine. Just make F-Zero. But you mentioned those two teams working together on it. That could be really fantastic. And I mean, the ARMS team, was that the team that was behind Mario Kart 7, or am I making that up?
Well, that's what I meant. The team that is behind both ARMS and Mario Kart is the same team. So I think that
okay,
team,
that's
that
that's why
EPG
I thought
team,
that. Okay.
Yeah, I think
see
that
what you mean
team
now.
theoretically could make a new F-Zero, and it would be amazing.
Boy, that would be really cool. Although, I will also say, and don't get me wrong, I totally want that, but I would also love if they brought Sega back too. People forget Sega made GX, and so it would just be really awesome to see even them come back.
For sure.
Everyone
I would love
worked.
it if they were to do that. Yeah, it's my favorite racing game of all time. Yeah.
It's so good. It's still good. That's the thing about F-Zero GX. I mean, really, all the F-Zero games, they're still good.
Yep.
It's just crazy how good they are. So, I love that one. I threw mine out last time. I'm Pikmin 4 is the one I'm putting my money on as like an out there prediction surprise. I think that game's being made. I don't think it's dead. I don't think it was Hey Pikmin, so I would love to see that one show up. I've kind of been predicting it for like a year and a half, but then the pandemic, I feel like that kind of changed plans, so who even knows. But I think with that, we're going to call it. This is a nice, awesome, lengthy conversation right before E3, so I think it's good that we spend a lot of extra time talking about this stuff. It's, like I said, it's days away. I mean, E3 starts like literally in 3 days from now, and like you said, 5 days from now, we'll be watching Nintendo's E3 Direct and their Treehouse, and everything we talked about will either be right or totally wrong, which is probably more than likely the case. So I do want to thank you again, Andres, for showing up. Really glad we found a way to finally get you on the channel here. As I kind of put together this like podcast concept and see how far I'm going to take it and what my long-term plans are going to be. I want to remind you guys that I'm going to have Andres linked below. I'm sure most of you know who he is, but please check out his channel. Push into 10K, right? We're trying to get you there before, what, Tuesday, the 15th?
It would be ideal. We'll see.
Yeah, I think that you deserve it, man. You definitely deserve it. I mean, like I said, you've had awesome growth so far this year. Your videos are doing amazing. Many of them get more views than me. And you're just getting crazy sub growth. So I would love to see you even maybe pass my sub growth by the time this year is over, if everything kind of keeps steamrolling that way. So please check it out. Again, thanks, Andres. I don't know if you have any last words you want to leave everyone with before we sign off.
Sure. Well, thanks you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to have discussions with you, man. There's actually tons of things I would like to say, but I know we got to end this soon. So, couple things. I'll just throw out a couple other random predictions out there that I put on my own channel. I think there'll probably be like a smaller Kirby announcement, and there might also be like a Mario Rabbids Kingdom battle thing, maybe. That's just a couple predictions I wanted to sort of put out there. Going beyond that, one more thing. I don't know if you're aware of this, right? But I'm predicting Breath of the Wild 2 comes out October 29th. That's my birthday. Oh, it's a Friday.
Really?
2 days before Halloween. Nintendo always releases software on Fridays, right?
Dude.
So I know that Skyward Sword HD is coming on your birthday. How cool would it be if we get a Zelda game for each of our birthdays this year?
That would be, I don't even know what it would be, but it would be definitely amazing. And I think, oh wow, that would be so, and it would be really cool for you because you would be getting the newer Zelda game.
Yeah.
So, wow, interesting. Okay, October 29th. So we'll keep an eye on that. I hope.
At least wish me a happy birthday.
Yeah, if you don't get a birthday present from Nintendo in the form of Breath of the Wild 2, at least a happy birthday for sure.
Yeah.
So, interesting. Okay, well, I'm glad you had those couple last-minute nuggets. I appreciate you coming on. Again, thanks so much, everybody, for watching. Like I said, I'm kind of figuring out this podcast thing and if this is something I want to do more regularly or not and try to get some rotating guests. I might even try to make it something where it's more of a solidified guest list. And Andres, obviously, I would have you on like very, very often if I do start doing
that would be awesome. I'd love
every week or every month. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've had me on your podcast, I think, about 4 or 5 times, and always had a really, really good time. So I think with that, I mean, we're going to sign off. This will be it until after E3. I will say this. I am going to hold a post-Nintendo E3 discussion. It'll be a little difficult for me. I don't want to go into too much, but I'm actually getting surgery the day of their stupid Direct. Yeah, so I'm going to have a couple days of healing, but hopefully before that week is over, if I'm of the ability to do it, I'm hoping to hold like kind of a wrap-up discussion as well. So that's a little bit in flux. We'll see how that goes. But, so yeah, I think for now, we're going to call this. Thanks again, Andres. Thanks to everybody for watching. Hopefully E3 is amazing and we love what Nintendo shows and Zelda's coming and all that fun stuff. And I'll see you on another video very soon. So, bye-bye.
Bye.